Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Anti-Racism as Collecting Organizations. My name is Leah Descher, and I'm an Education and Outreach Specialist for DHPSNY. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. And this webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with the PDF version of the slideshow, will be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. I want to start things off by sharing a little bit about the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York program. DHPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, the services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY planning services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. To learn more about our services, please visit DHPSNY.org. I'm going to kick things over to John Diefendorfer, an archivist with the New York State Archives, who leads the Documentary Heritage Program, so he can speak a little bit to this work today within the larger context of New York State Education Department's DEI work. So go ahead, John.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming today. It's good to see-ish everyone. Just to sort of situate this, the New York State Library and New York State Archives, which are the sort of sponsoring institutions for DHPSNY, operate under the auspices of the State Education Department. And the State Education Department is overseen by the New York State Board of Regents. In April of 2021, the Board of Regents offered their framework on diversity, equity, and inclusion in New York schools, sort of a call to action, and subsequently issued their culturally responsive sustaining education framework. These series of webinars that DHPSNY is doing is an effort on behalf of the State Archives and State Library to extend the work of the Board of Regents into the cultural heritage community and address these issues in the context of collecting organizations across New York State. So that's sort of things in a nutshell, and I will pass this back to Leah.
Thank you, John. As he was saying, because DHPSNY is positioned as a resource and a connector for cultural heritage organizations throughout the state, we have recognized that it's important for our efforts to be more actively engaged in doing and fostering anti-racism work within this field. So for this reason, we've been working with Aria Strategies to get a sense of what type of work our constituents are already doing and where folks like you around the state are interested in further developing their learning. Aria Strategies is a firm that provides mission-driven solutions for nonprofits based in Rochester, New York, and we are really very, very grateful to have them presenting this webinar today, as well as a couple of other upcoming programs that will center on anti-racism work and collecting organizations. So please keep an eye out for those on our calendar. And with that, I'm going to pass things off to our presenters for the day to get us started.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks, John. We just want to introduce ourselves real quick. My name is Aria Camaione-Lind. I am the principal and CEO of Aria Strategies, like Leah said, a consulting practice that works with not-for-profits across New York State. And I'm really excited to be here today with my colleagues, Ashley Gantt and Amanda Smith. Ashley, do you want to introduce yourself and then pass it over to Amanda to introduce herself?
Sure. Thank you, Aria. Hey, everyone. My name is Ashley Gantt. Full-time, I work for the ACLU, and part-time, I work with consulting with Aria Strategies. I'm really excited to be here today and really interested to see what we can build together. So thanks for having us, and I'll pass it to Amanda.
Hello, everybody. I'm Amanda Smith, also a consultant with Aria Strategies, and really excited to be here and do our first webinar with you.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Amanda. To get us started today, first, we want to say thanks to New York State Archive, New York State Library, and DHPSNY for inviting us into this space. And we want to ask you something that Ibram Kendi asks in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. The question for each of us is, what side of history will we stand on? And Leah is going to pop a link into the chat. And we're going to ask you, how does this land with you? What does this mean to you? And I'll ask you to share those thoughts in the link that Leah puts into the chat. And we'll give ourselves a few minutes to think about this and to enter our answers. So how does this land with you? And what does this mean to you? While you're answering those questions, I'm going to pull up a different screen so you can see your answers. So Leah put the link in the chat, and you can go ahead and put your answers in. The question for each of us is, what side of history will we stand on? How does this land with you? And what does this mean to you? You can see we've got some responses coming in. Making sure we treat all humans with dignity and respect, and preserving their stories for the future. There are choices we can make that uphold status quo and systems of power, or that we upend those things. History is not a neutral space. It means doing the right thing, doing right by others, actions and thoughts suggest that there are moral decisions being made. What will we do on a daily basis to further dismantle unjust systems? On one hand, I want to be on what I think is the right side of history. On the other hand, I think history is too complicated to be described as having sides that a person can always be on one or the other. I want to be kind and live well. Thinking of how we will be remembered, but also who has not been remembered intentionally. This question makes me wonder if this is the best question for us to ask. I believe that the issue is greater than where I land in history. Right. Give folks another minute or so to add in their thoughts. Thanks, everybody. Oh, thanks, Leah. Leah's going to move any chat comments over to the Mentimeter board. And you'll have a chance to see this after the webinar today. We'll provide some additional resources, and we'll provide graphics of all your input today. So you'll get to see that. I'm going to pass it over to my teammate, Ashley, to talk us through setting the space for today's webinar. Ashley, I'm about to pull up those slides for you.
Thank you, Aria. So hey, everyone again. I know the first workshop we did, we went over what we call norms and agreements. And for the folks who were in the workshop, some of this will sound familiar to you. And for other folks, maybe it'll sound new. But if you have any questions, if you want to add anything, please feel free to put that in the chat. So first, I'll just go over the norms and agreements that we came up with collectively to kind of set the space and kind of lead the conversation so that we're all going in the same direction. So number one, we have lead with love. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory. You know, everything that we're doing at the end of the day, we want it to stand on love, not just for us, but for the generations to come behind us. And hopefully that perspective guides the conversations. When we're talking about race, is a very difficult conversation to have. So leading with love is always like number one. Number two, this is a journey. Sometimes the road is bumpy, but we're all going together. Drop the mic, step up and step back. That means if a person have been talking a lot and you notice someone is in the space who haven't been talking a lot or given their input, we step back to make sure that we give everyone the space and opportunity to speak. The next one we have is speak for yourself. I'm going to couple that with using I statements. Next, we have inclusion, making sure that like when we're talking from a place of one intersectionality, and then we're leaving our hearts and minds open to other people's perspectives and experiences. Respect, we want to respect everyone in the conversation, everyone who's online today. That's both us as facilitators and you all as participants in the chat. Mutual positive regard. We have direct communication. Come to the space teachable. I like to say we don't know everything. We're all showing up in this space trying to learn together. So just keeping that at the forefront of these conversations. Opening your mind, really listening, and not necessarily listening to just respond, but listening to hear with both our ears and our heart. Stay engaged. Sometimes we don't want to create a space where we're just talking at people. We want people to be engaged, participating in the Menti projects, participating in the comments. That's how we grow. Speak your truth. Experience discomfort. Again, when we're talking about race, it's a very uncomfortable situation, but we encourage folks to lean into that discomfort, including ourselves as facilitators. Expect and accept non-closure. Ask questions in the chat or message directly. If we say something or we reference something and you don't understand or you have more questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll address it when we see it. Be responsible for what you hear. When you don't know the information, it's willful ignorance, but once you have the information, we want people to feel that weight and responsibility to move and do something about the information that they've received. Again, use I statements. Assume the best intentions from everyone. And last but not least, love each other into education. So those were our norms and agreements. I want to talk a little bit about the objective. So the objectives for this is at the end of this webinar, participants will have a foundational understanding of anti-racism and be able to articulate at least 2 ways they will use the principles of anti-racism in their organizations and in their own practices. The agenda for the day, what we'll be doing, we'll be making a case. The basics, we'll be talking about the basics of anti-racism. We'll be talking about anti-racism itself. We'll go over the history of anti-racism. We'll talk about anti-racism and collecting organizations and what that looks like. We'll have a discussion and debrief about the things that we've talked about today. We'll leave it open for questions and comments. And then we'll talk about next steps and invitation to continued education and learning. And then we'll check out. A little bit about the structure and the expectations of today. So today's structure builds community. We share information, discussion, debriefs, and make plans for the future. You can expect to feel uncomfortable, curious, frustrated, heard, confused, and surprised. And I'll pass it over to Aria. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Ashley. So before I get started on this section around making the case, I wanted to quickly mention that we spent 2021 doing public engagement for these projects. Leah mentioned that we'll be with all of you throughout the year doing dialogues and webinars. And in order to get prepared for that, we conducted focus groups, interviews, and we really listened to what the DHPSNY community had to say about anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion and moving this work forward. And so what came up over and over again was this need to make the case for doing this work, that folks seem to have this internal understanding of why this is important, but articulating that to the rest of their organization, to their constituents and their stakeholders, that was important. And so we decided to open up today with some conversation around making the case. So that's what I'm going to take us through next. Hang on, I went too far. Oh boy, give me 2 seconds. My slides jumped way ahead. All right, I think I've got it now. There we go. Okay, thanks for your patience. Whose land is this? So when we're making the case, we need to think about whose land is this? Most of New York State is unceded land and legally belongs to our indigenous communities because the treaties that early colonizers made with Native nations were not ratified by Congress. This map is from nativelanguages.org, and this shows the Native communities that lived in New York State and some of their territorial boundaries before colonization and during the early colonizer period. There are 9 Indian reservations in New York State. Some are sovereign and some are not. Sovereign nations are recognized by the federal government, but tribal nations might still have a reservation and not be recognized by the federal government. The Oneida and Cayuga nations have ongoing land claims in parts of New York State that change the amount of land under Native control depending on where those land claims are in the court system. So when we're thinking about whose land is this, New York State is 54,556 square miles. 13.6% of that is water. In total, the 9 Indian reservations include 120.97 square miles, and 9% of that is water. So really, when we're talking about whose land is this, we need to really be thinking about whose land are we on? How are we using it? How are they engaged? And also, what does that look like compared to the rest of New York State? All of New York's land and water deserves and requires Indigenous involvement. Native communities have been the stewards of these spaces for thousands of years. We are all on Native land. New York is one of the most diverse states in the Union. Almost 20% of New Yorkers are Hispanic. That's 1 in 5. 22% of New Yorkers were born outside of the United States. That's a 1 in 5 New Yorkers. By 2035, New York will be a minoritized majority state. New York has varying levels of abilities. Almost 8% of New Yorkers under the age of 65 have a disability. That is almost 1 in 10. 21% of school-aged P12, so pre-K through grade 12 children, have a federally recognized disability category. That's 1 in 5. So New York is made up of wonderful and intense differences that make us a really special community. Our population is shifting. 20% of New York's population is under 18. This is important because it's a steady decline over the past 20 years. Our population is getting older, and the amount of young people we have, the amount of children we have in New York is getting smaller. 57% of school-age children are children of color. So as our population of kids gets smaller, we also are seeing that most of our kids are children of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Today's children make the organizations of tomorrow. They're our professionals, they're our colleagues, they're our donors, and there are end users. And so understanding how the population is changing in New York is an important part of understanding why we need to do this work. And then finally, there's a business case for this. Anti-racism creates better business models and user experiences. The data shows that organizations with anti-racist policies, systems, and practices outperform organizations who uphold the status quo in areas of employee productivity, revenue, accountability, and engagement. It's time to build organizations and systems that serve all of our communities. And with that, I am going to pass it over to my colleague Amanda to talk about the basics of anti-racism with us.
Thank you, Aria. Okay, so basics of anti-racism, just like everything else, anti-racism is dynamic and it's a sophisticated concept. So there are types of racism and anti-racism. Anti-racism is intersectional. People and power disrupt or uphold how racism and anti-racism show up in our organizations. And anti-racism is active and participatory. So we're going to talk a little bit about the types of racism and anti-racism. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi writes that racist and anti-racist are like peelable name tags that are placed and replaced based on what someone is doing or not doing, supporting or expressing in each moment. So racism can be internalized, it can be interpersonal, it can be institutional, or it can be structural. Internalized racism comprises our private beliefs and biases about race and racism influenced by our culture. This can take many different forms, including prejudice towards others of a different race, internalized oppression, the negative beliefs about oneself by people of color, or internalized privilege, beliefs about superiority or entitlement by white people. Interpersonal racism is the bias that occurs when individuals interact with others and their personal racial beliefs affect their public interactions. Institutional racism refers to the unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions, such as our schools and our workplaces, that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institutions when they reinforce racial inequities. Structural racism involves the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of societal factors, including the history, culture, ideology, and interactions of institutions and policies that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. So Aria created an example using racism against the Asian community that we're going to talk through a little bit. So internalized racism would look like thinking that Asians are good at math, but bad drivers. And that would show up as interpersonal racism if someone is making a disparaging comment to their Asian coworker about the Asian driver that they passed on their commute, and then joking about how being good at math at least makes up for it. Institutional racism would look like your science museum routinely hires Asian researchers, but skips educator candidates with Asian sounding names. And structural racism would show up as in the Asian community in your town who was devastated by Executive Order 9066 and hasn't yet recovered. So those are some examples of kind of how that looks at different levels. And I'm going to pass it over to Ashley.
Ashley, you're muted.
Wow, I came out really strong, like, hey, you guys, and I was muted. So anyways, I have the task of trying to explain these three words: prejudice, bias, and racism. And I have to tell you, these are conversations that we're having all the time in every circle that I'm in, whether it's at work, whether it's community work, whether it's consulting work, we're always talking about these three things, how they show up and what they mean. So we want to have a little conversation about it. And when I say conversation, I literally mean conversation. Like, I don't want to just talk to you guys. I also want to read your thoughts and your opinions in the chat. So please feel free to ask questions and put comments in the chat. So let's just start with the three words. So prejudice, we can all agree that prejudice is judgment, bias, judgment, which is judgment based on prejudice, and racism, which is prejudice and bias in conjunction with money, power, and influence. So if prejudice is when a group or individual judges another group based on their gender, their origin, their origin, their sexual orientation, their religion, their language, their speech, their educational background, and or their socioeconomic status, then bias is when you feel or show prejudice against or preference for someone or something based on a person or a group's prejudice. Bias is our prejudice in action. Racism is when our bias and our prejudice meet money, power, and influence. We know that there's a diversity in thought and scholarship, but this is a part of our own ideological grounding for today's conversation. So for our conversation today, we are making the assertion that Black people cannot be racist, but can be prejudiced. That is a debate and a conversation that is constantly happening. So I want to remind us again that racism is when prejudice and bias are in conjunction and meet money, power, and influence. So how do power and racism interact? Racism is a convergence of money, power, bias, and influence to take action or make statements against a person or a group based on their race. Power makes racism possible. Anti-racism is intersectional. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this in his early American race consciousness book, The Souls of Black Folks. When he wrote about the dueling consciousness of Black people in America, he wrote, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings." I want to just insert, I've heard this quote referenced many, many, many times. And not until I started having deep conversations with not just African Americans, but also Africans who have immigrated to America. For example, I was having a conversation again about prejudice, bias, and racism with my partner. He is from Haiti. And one thing he said to me was, I get tired of being a Black man in America. And I didn't understand what he meant. And when we broke that down, when we dug deeper into the conversation, what he said was, in Haiti, I'm just my last name. I'm just my father's son. But in America, everywhere I turn, I'm a Black man. I can't go to work. I can't go to school. I can't go to the store. I can't go to the gas station without the constant reminder that I'm a Black man. And thinking about that weight that Black folks carry every single day, going in different spaces, whether it be museums, schools, stores, movie theaters, that's what this quotes me. That's what this quote is really talking about, the two-ness of a Black person, a Negro in America, and what that means. Moving on to our next point, local scholar Kimberly Crenshaw addresses this in her scholarship of Blackness and womanhood, and the urgency of understanding our lived experiences as intersectional. For example, people hold many identities. Each identity comes with a benefit or privilege, and also with barriers or obstacles. We illustrated 4 of the identities held by an example individual. For example, the person is Black, transgender, lives in Mohawk Valley, uses a wheelchair for mobility. No, not one of these identities capture the person's full experience, but each of these identities build an additional lens to which the person experiences the world. People and power. People and power, they have or they don't have influence. People and the power they have or don't have influence the systems and structures of our organizations, every single organization. So there's not an organization in America that people in the power they have don't influence. Personal education and advocacy leads to actions and decisions. Personal actions and decisions lead to systematic change, which is why we're here today talking about how do we use the tools and the skills and the privilege that we have to change and make change in the spaces that we're in. So I'll turn it over to Amanda right now to talk about how we do that through allyship.
Thank you. So a couple notes on allyship. So white people must commit to anti-racist acts of allyship. Allyship costs you something. So when we're thinking about allyship, we want to think about, what sacrifice are you making for the liberation of people of color? It really should be a lifestyle choice. And we always want to bring into the conversation that no one group is a monolith. And there's diversity of beliefs among BIPOC folks / people of the global majority. But the bottom line is that white people don't get to decide for BIPOC folks and people of the global majority. So again, just really thinking about that lifestyle, thinking about that it costs you something, you have to be personally invested, and it means making sacrifices of your own privilege to boost up and fight against the oppression of Black and brown folks. I'm going to pass it back to Ashley.
Thanks, Amanda. So I feel like we've talked a lot, but talking means nothing without action. So I want to talk a little bit about how we activate our anti-racism. So number one, anti-racism is active and participatory. You have to be doing something. And I think a lot of times people feel like, well, I don't know what to do in my space, but the very meaning of anti-racism is finding out how to do anti-racist work in whatever space you're in. So anti-racism is people intentionally working to learn and unlearn practices and systems rooted in white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism. Our anti-racist actions can be personal, interpersonal, structural, and systematic. Anti-racism looks for disparities and dismantles them. It is proactive. I just want to say that part again. Anti-racism looks for disparities and dismantles them. It is proactive. For me, that is the biggest action item that any of us can take away from this. If we're doing anti-racist work, then it is our job to look for the disparities in whatever space we're in. And then last but not least, racist or anti-racist actions are binary that we all live in. So we all have a responsibility to do the work, to look for those disparities and discrepancies in any space that we're in, and not just work to correct it for us being in that space, but the work that we do to correct those disparities, the generations that come behind us will be impacted by it. So I'll pass it to Aria to talk about some of the vocabulary.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm actually going to start us off with something that Ibram Kendi says in How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says, definitions anchor us in principles. This is not a light point. If we don't do the basic work of defining the kind of people we want to be in language that is stable and consistent, we can't work towards stable, consistent goals. Some of my most consequential steps toward being an anti-racist have been the moments when I arrived at basic definitions. To be an anti-racist is to set lucid definitions of racism and anti-racism, racist and anti-racist policies, racist and anti-racist ideas, racist and anti-racist people. To be a racist is to constantly redefine racist in a way that exonerates one's changing policies, ideas, and personhood. So we created a working definitions list, and we're going to share that. We didn't plan in the time, I should say. You know, every decision is intentional, but we didn't plan in the time to go over definitions with you today. But I will share that we have working definitions that will be shared after the webinar for ally and allyship, anti-racism, bias, BIPOC, capitalism, colonialism, the delusion of white supremacy, diversity, equity, imperialism, inclusion, justice, liberation, minoritized, Native and Indigenous, PGM, people of the global majority, prejudice, race, racism, reparations, and representations. And we look forward to adding to that list of working definitions because we'll be working together for some time on these concepts and on this work. And so we're excited to bring all of you into the conversation. What I also want to talk about is that when we're talking about anti-racism, we also need to acknowledge that we have anti-racist ways of being and knowing. And these ways of being and knowing are transformational. They're grounded in relational capacity. They inhabit humility. They center listening to directly impacted people. They allow us to be teachable, which then lets us have transformational experiences around our own racism and our own anti-racism. The last thing I want to say about this is that this allows white folks to inhabit a space where we can assume we don't know what it's like to be a Black, Indigenous, or other person of color in New York State, using our organizations, working with us, trying to be in relationship with us. Lived experience is our guiding light in anti-racism, and listening to directly impacted people is the thing that allows us to grow and change in our racism and anti-racism. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Amanda to talk us through the history of anti-racism.
Okay, thank you, Aria. So we're just going to go on a little journey back in time and kind of talk about how we got to be where we are in our understanding of anti-racism today. So as we talk through the history of anti-racism, we want to remind folks that what once seemed anti-racist can now be labeled as racist. Ibram Kendi treats this reality in his discussion of assimilationists and segregationists. But today we're going to kind of forego that important nuance and talk through a more linear history of anti-racist thought. So racism and the delusion of white supremacy, and we say that because white supremacy isn't real, it's a delusion, it's an understanding that people have that isn't a correct understanding. That delusion of white supremacy came to North America in what would become the US with the earliest European colonizers. While some of the earliest racist policies, practices, and systems came from the earliest Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, so too did some of the earliest anti-racist writings and ideas come from the Spanish and Portuguese clergy in the early 16th century. So people like Bartolomé de las Casas and Antonio de Montesinos, who pushed back on their government's treatment of indigenous communities and enslaved people. As we move into the 17th century, religious groups like the Religious Society of Friends begin to more clearly articulate abolitionist and anti-slavery ideologies. Anti-slavery abolition is a big part of the infancy of anti-racism in New York State. Abolition in New York extends through the colonial and federal periods, even as some New Yorkers continued to enslave people of the African diaspora until it was outlawed in 1827. After 1827, New York abolition focused on abolition in other parts of the Union. And as we moved through the 19th century, anti-racism leans in a scientific direction with anthropologists, ethnographers, biologists, and biological ethnographers using the scientific method to disprove prior assertions by naturalists and anatomists that Black people had smaller brains and skulls than white people and were therefore less intelligent than white people. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, at the close of World War I, we see non-white diplomats and politicians attempt to include an anti-racist clause in the treaty. After World War I, BIPOC and white anti-racist musicians, artists, and anthropologists argued forcefully against racism. In the mid-20th century, we see the advent of the modern civil rights movement and attendant anti-racist actions, writings, and teachings. In the 21st century, we entered a new phase of the history of anti-racism. Catalyzed by Black women speaking out against police violence that predominantly affected Black men, we got the Black Lives Matter movement. This led to consciousness raising in white communities and a drawing in of more white folks to conversations that people of the global majority have been having for hundreds of years. This century has given us new language around microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion. We learned about bias and systemic racism in new ways from Harvard and Layla Saad and Ibram Kendi, among many, many, many others. We are encouraged in a fight for the survival of telling and interpreting actual history in critical, authentic, and honest ways. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aria to talk more specifically about anti-racism in collecting organizations.
Thanks, Amanda. So anti-racism in collecting organizations has many facets. Personal and organizational work, policy, systems and practices, curiosity, evaluation, and analysis. These are the three things that are going to ground us in our conversation around anti-racism in collecting organizations. So let's talk about personal and organizational work. People can uphold or dismantle racism in the organizations we work for. In order to be actively anti-racist, we need to reflect on where we are in our journey and how we show up in our organizations. Organizations might hold the structural and systemic oppression of people of color, but the people in the organizations can either hold or dismantle that. So I want to know, where are you on your own anti-racist journey? Where is your organization on its anti-racist journey? And what about the people who use your collection and your organization? Where are they? The policy, systems, and practices of our organizations can also uphold or dismantle anti-racism. Kendi uses the example of climate change when he talks about policies. Do nothing climate policy is a racist policy, he says, since the predominantly non-white global South is victimized by climate change more than the whiter global North, even as the whiter global North is contributing more to its acceleration. So I want to know from you, what policy, systems, and practices at your organization uphold the delusion of white supremacy? Which policy, systems, and practices dismantle that delusion? Are any of them actively racist or exclusionary? Or any of them actively anti-racist? How does racism and anti-racism influence the practices at your organization? How does it influence your own personal practice at a collections organization? And then we've got curiosity, evaluation, and analysis. As practitioners in museums, libraries, and archives, anti-racism requires that we be curious, evaluate ourselves, our organizations, and our efforts. We have to analyze what is working and what can be better. We have to let go of our ego and fear and embrace humility and thoughtfulness. So I wonder, what about your literal collections? Shout out to Amanda for pulling that up when we were prepping this webinar. We were coming up with all these prompts and questions, and Amanda said, what about the literal collections? What needs to happen in order for your literal collections to be anti-racist? Whose materials does your organization have? How did your organization get them? Is your organization the right place for those materials? Are any parts of your collection harmful to specific groups of people? How do you handle the harm that your collections have caused? And so we're going to pause here and we're going to take a break, because when we come back from our break, we're going to have a conversation, me, Amanda, and Ashley, about reparations. And we're going to talk through some thoughts that we have and then invite you into the conversation. But it's very important to take care of yourself during conversations like this and as we go through our own personal anti-racist journeys. So we're going to pause for 5 minutes. We'll see you back here at 12:51. And I encourage you to take care of yourself, drink some water, eat something nutritious, take care of your body, take care of your spirit, and we will see you at 12:51. If you had the chance, welcome back. I hope you had the chance to take care of yourselves. So for the next few minutes, Ashley, Amanda, and I are going to have a conversation about reparations. I will start off by saying Ashley and Amanda and I have known each other for a long time. We've been working together for many years. We're neighbors. We are out in the streets together. Ashley's an organizer and a civil rights leader in Rochester, and Amanda and I participate in the actions that she plans. And so we have deep relationship between the three of us and a lot of respect. And so the conversation we're going to have today and then invite you into is grounded in that relational capacity. It's grounded in centering the lived experiences of people of color. And built into that is a lot of respect. And so I'm going to kick us off just by saying that when we were doing our final prep and run through of this webinar, we wanted to have a conversation. And at first we thought the conversation was going to be about one thing, but then we started talking about the definition of justice. And that led us into a conversation where we lingered on reparations. So with that framing, I just want to invite Amanda and Ashley into this conversation to sort of talk through where we are with our understanding of things like reparations. So Amanda, Ashley, what do you think?
I think let's dig in. I want to also say these conversations are very hard and complex. And even in our prep for this, I had to take a step back to say, wow, let me figure out how I really feel, or let me figure out why I think like this, or let me figure out why my reaction is this way. And I know if we feel like this and we're facilitators, listening to this could also have other people feeling uncomfortable, but I just want to encourage folks again to lean in. These are very steep conversations. So as we dig in, also, we don't have all of the answers. My favorite part of this whole thing is I can't wait until the audience can participate and ask questions back. I can't wait for that portion. So as we dig into this conversation, please feel free to put your comments in the chat and to participate along with us. I can go on and on, so I'll pause to see if Amanda has something to
No, you're good.
Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit, Amanda, about what we mean when we're talking about reparations? Like what specific reparations are we talking about?
Yeah, so traditionally when we think about reparations, we're thinking about reparations that absolve or address the legacy in the United States of chattel slavery. And that can look a lot of different ways. A lot of times people talk about that in terms of money. And a lot of times people talk about it like historically it's been, land, and it's this idea of kind of repayment. But that was kind of part of the conversation that we ended up really getting into, was that how do you really repay or repair? That's what reparations, it's about kind of repairing an injustice. And so what does that really look like? And we had a lot to talk about it. It's not simple answers.
I want to talk about the when we were talking about justice, so the thing about creating working definitions is the dictionary is not where it's at for stuff like this. Dictionaries are how we're using the word now, but not how, or I guess how we were using the word when the dictionary was printed, I guess. But all of these definitions evolve and need to be restated as we get deeper into this work and understand more about this work. And so we really paused on this definition around justice. And we said it's the ability to make a people or thing whole from previous injustice by repairing harm. And then Ashley was like, what? Because when we're talking about reparations, how can I ever be whole from that? Like, how can I ever be whole from the legacy of chattel slavery that like infects my family history? And so I want to toss it to Ashley to like talk more about that, like, how does that understanding of like healing and wholeness resonate or not resonate?
Yeah, so first, when we talk about reparations, it's a conversation that's happening in Rochester. It's a conversation that's happening across New York. It's happening in Congress, and it's happening across the nation. And talking and thinking about this, I'm thinking, you know, what if we do get reparations? What if we do get financially compensated for what we lost? Will that make us whole, right? Don't get me wrong. We still want your land and we still want your coin, right? I'm not saying we want it, we need it, and lives will be changed because of it. But does that really make Black and Brown folks whole? Does it really make Indigenous people whole? And for me, it doesn't. We still don't know our history. We don't know what tribal nations or what Indigenous tribe we come from. We don't know our history. And what makes it so clear to me is that I have a partner who grew up in Haiti, like literally grew up in Haiti. And we talk a lot. And when we're talking about family history, he can sit down and he can tell me why one side of his family is light skinned and the other side is dark skinned, and what that dynamic looks like in his family. He can tell us where his grandfather and his great grandfather come from. And listening to these stories, I'll be both amazed and feeling jealousy, because as a Black African American, I don't have that history. I can never sit down with my daughter or my grandchildren and tell them where my great grandmother came from, tell them how we migrated to New York. Like, we don't have that history to tell. And it's saddening when I ask him, like, how do you have all of this information? Because he's literally one of the only Black people I know who can tell his family history in a way that like moves generations. And one thing he said to me was like, when we were little, our families, our cousins, all of us would sit at our grandfather's house and our great grandfather's house, and they would tell us the stories of where we come from. They would tell us the stories of the tribes that we belong to. I mentioned earlier that he said to me, he wanted to move back to Haiti because he was tired of being a Black man in America. And when he first said it, I didn't understand. I'm like, well, aren't you a Black man in Haiti? And he's like, no, like in Haiti, I'm just my grandfather's last name. You know, I'm just, well, I don't want to say his name for the people who use Google, but listening to him helped me understand what I already got, what I was missing, but the reality that we're really missing something as African Americans, not being able to tell that history. The conversation around critical race theory comes up a lot across the nation. Every blog post, you know, you can get sucked into a black hole on the internet just researching that topic. And after Aria, Amanda, and I was talking about this, I left our conversation frustrated. And not because of Aria and Amanda, but I had to take a step back and say, why do I feel so angry about this? And I think it's an anger that is rightly justified. And if I had to think of a way where Black and Brown folks can get reparations, and especially basing it around the conversation that we're having today with collecting organizations, it would be to tell the truth. We just need people to tell the truth about the history of Black folks in America and the history of Black folks, period. And as African Americans, we're not going to get that history in school. We're not going to get it in history class. We're not going to get it in social studies. We're not going to get that history anywhere. And the amazing privilege and opportunity that collecting organizations have is that from this point on, because of the information, Black and Brown kids, because of what you decide to do with the information that you have, can step in a museum and really find that history. I always tell my daughter, she's a 12-year-old Black girl growing up, and she goes to a majority white school, and I'm battling with that every single day. But I don't want her first introduction to Black folks and our history to be slavery. We were kings and queens, and no one ever tells that story. And when we're talking about the history of Black folks, we're usually talking about it from a point of slavery. And those are the things. When I think about reparations, when I think about what Black folks want, when I think about what can change the lives of the generations to come in America of Black and brown children, and I don't mean just African-American children, I mean Black and brown children across the diaspora, is hearing the truth, telling the truth. And that sounds so light, but it is so heavy. It is such a heavy thing to do. And we see that when we turn on CNN, when we turn on Fox News, and folks are having this conversation, this really emotional conversation about if critical race theory should be taught in our schools. And for me, I'm like, reparations, tell the truth. Talk about who we really are. Talk about where we really come from. And let me just also add again, we still want the land and the coins, but we also want to be able to tell the truth. And I think as collecting organizations, you guys have the power to do that. You guys have a power to set the stage and set the atmosphere so that when brown and Black girls and boys walk into these museums, because that's who it will be. If people are going to be walking into these museums in the next 30 years, 20 years, it's going to be brown and Black children who are now adults. That is a large percent of the population in New York. And how amazing would it be for my daughter to be able to say to her daughter, I'm going to take you to the museum so you can figure out, so you can learn about who we actually were as Black people, and not just slaves. And although that story is important too, because I feel like it's a story of resilience. It's a story of deep rooted like resiliency that we don't see a lot. So those stories of slavery is important, but it's only 400 years old. So who are we before those? And I feel like you all have the opportunity to tell those stories. And once we start telling those stories, it shapes how Black and brown kids think about themselves. It shapes the way they see themselves. I can't tell you the first time I walked into a museum and I saw my face on the wall, I was like, oh shit. Oh shoot, sorry. I was like, my daughter felt like that too. She stood a little taller because she was able to walk in a museum and see her mom. And yeah, for whatever reason, I was there for the work that we've done on the ground here in Rochester, but how many more Black and brown kids would stand taller if they were able to walk in museums and see the history of kings and queens and not just slaves? So sorry, reparations. So coins, lands, and the truth.
That's right. Amen. So I'll say sometimes Ashley, Amanda, and I curse. We apologize. So forgive us when it slips out. So I would just add to what Ashley says: kings, queens, doctors, teachers, spiritual leaders, the Africans who were kidnapped in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s and 1800s were not slaves. They were people, and they have stories, and we all deserve those stories. Ashley, did you want to add anything before I take us into the next part of the conversation?
I was gonna say no, but so I guess yeah. So and even though all of the stories are, I just want to really drive home that all of the stories are necessary. So the stories of Black and brown folks being kings and queens, the story of our ancestors who jumped off in the Atlantic because they decided that they were not going to be slaves. Those stories are powerful, and they need to be told in a way that our children, it brings value to them. I just can't point out how disheartening it is to walk into museum after museum and see our stories barely told or told through the eyes of slavery or just slavery. So yeah, that's it. I can talk about this forever, but I'm done chill.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm getting some feedback in the chat saying that my audio is echoey. So Ashley and Amanda, if when I'm talking, could you mute yourself so it doesn't create echoes? Thanks. I hope that helps it. So Amanda and I were gonna kind of bring this back to you. So Amanda, do you want to start to bring it back to collecting organizations in this group? What we do with what Ashley shared?
Sure. Yeah. So now that we've heard all of that, which may be a fairly new perspective to a lot of folks here, I would guess that it probably is. How do we sit with that, and how do we hold that as people who work for organizations that collect and remember these histories, or maybe don't, maybe not enough?
Yeah, thanks. And I would just add to that, how do we acknowledge and name the work that needs to happen in collecting organizations to begin to make folks who have been harmed whole from previous injustice? How do we do what Ashley said? How do we continue to advocate for land and coin? And how do we also hold ourselves accountable to the truth? And so my next question for you is, where do we go from here? So Leah has a couple of links she's going to share in the chat. And again, we like to use Mentimeter to get participant feedback. So there are links, and you're going to answer some prompts. The first two prompts go with the first link, and then the second two prompts go with the second link. So our first two prompts are, what are your priorities for continuing your anti-racist journey? 1, 2, 3, how many priorities do you have? Just think of a word or a couple words. What are your priorities for creating an anti-racist organization? So we're gonna keep pulling these two things forward, you'll notice. What about you? What about your organization? And so that's what we wanna hear about. What are your priorities? And what are your priorities for creating an anti-racist organization? And so we'll invite you to answer those prompts. I'm going to pull up a screen so you can see each other's priorities.
Aria, as you pull up the screen so people can see each other's priorities, would you mind reading some of them, since some of us may be on our phones taking this? And
yes, for sure, like I did with the check-in, for sure I can. Great. So we've got genuine connection. These are priorities for your own personal journey. Genuine connection, self-education, active listening, consistent learning, act and action, question, notice racism, listen, learn, reading and research. This is great. Thank you. I love that listening right now is like one of the biggest words. It means we're getting a lot of input around listening. I'm going to move us to the next screen, which is, what are your priorities for your organization? And like I said, we like to share these graphics after the fact, so you'll get to see how it ends up after everybody puts in their feedback. So you can use the link that Leah shared, or you can go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and you can use the code 73443484. What are your priorities for creating an anti-racist organization? I'm going to put this link in the chat again. Looks like somebody was going to write telling the truth. Love it. Advocate, ask questions, inclusive voices, diverse voices, inclusive stories, outreach, ask questions, discussion, proactive, share, transparency. I love these. This looks great. telling, encourage, representation at all levels, revise policies, environment change, understanding community intentionality, research, connecting. I love it. I love that outreach and transparency are the biggest ones right now. That just feels like telling the truth and getting out there to your communities and being transparent with what you're doing. That feels really, really meaningful. These are great. Leah, I'm going to ask you to pop that second link in the chat because this is a question about resources. What resources do you already have to help you with these priorities? And then there's a second question on this link. What resources do you need? So start with that first one. What resources do you already have? What's already within arm's reach for you? Oh yeah, Scarlett put in the chat. Plus the truth is so much more interesting, allowing for richer and fuller stories. Agree. Hard agree from me. I'm gonna get that other screen pulled up so we can look at the resources. So these are, what resources do you already have? Collections, yeah, your collections are a huge resource. Willingness to try, others' lived experiences, yes, other museums, yeah, other people's collections, that's right. The internet, thank goodness for Google and all of the information at our fingertips. Hope, community, friends, you have your libraries, your oral histories, you have your skills, your curiosity, your colleagues, huge resource in colleagues, commitment, professional support. Yeah, these all look great. Access to organizations. I love the collections is like the biggest one right now. That is, that's real, y'all. Your collections are huge, huge resources for this. Love it. So the second question on this is, what do you need? What are the resources that you need as you work on your own personal anti-racist journey and the anti-racist journey for your organization? What resources do you need? Again, it's right up here at the top. You can go to menti.com and use the code 4013020. I'm also going to put this link in the chat. What resources do you need? Community, designated space, culture shift, more time, an open mind. Support, money, yeah. Language, great. Innovation. Designated spaces, time and money, those are big. More inclusive hiring, interesting, and a receptive audience. All right.
I was definitely going to bring that up.
A receptive audience. Do you want to talk?
Hiring.
Oh, more inclusive hiring.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we could do maybe a whole dialogue about that. What do you think? We could do a whole dialogue about inclusive hiring, credentialing, training people to take care of collections. I think that could be something really interesting. Connections to community, everyone doing the work. Yeah, curiosity. Organizations need money. Yeah. People, time, money, all of our most precious resources. Yeah, these are great. So, spoiler alert, I tried to do this a little faster than we had put on our agenda in the first place because on our break, Amanda, Ashley, and I were so excited to talk more with you and hear from you. So even though we gave ourselves tons of time to sort of debrief any of this, I feel like I love these graphics. I love what's coming out of your brains, and I want to hear from you. So I am going to pass it over to Amanda to get us transitioned into that space.
Thank you. Yes, we we literally all were on the break. We're like, when do we get to hear from people? We're so excited to hear from people. Our last session with everyone was a dialogue, and so we really enjoyed kind of that back and forth. So we're going to open it up. The floor is yours. You can enter into the chat, and we'll make sure to kind of read those out and respond to those. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think no, people can't come off mute in any way, right? We're just utilizing the chat mostly.
We can allow them to speak. It's
We
like
can, okay.
just for Ashley and Amanda, this is the same setup we used for the public meetings for the other project that we're working on together.
Perfect.
So
Okay.
we can I don't know if like the three of us can, but Leah can like pull people off mute if they want to ask their own question. But people can definitely put stuff in the chat as well.
Perfect. All right, well then do that too. We'd love to actually have back and forth dialogue as well.
Yep, and if any folks do want to verbally speak, all they have to do is press the raise your hand function, which should be on their little toolbar, either on the top or bottom of their screen, and then I can unmute them.
Perfect. Thank you, Leah.
And so if folks need a prompt to start the conversation, I'll give it a minute, but I have a burning question for folks. I saw that like under resources that you already have, a lot of people put collections. And I'd like to know who decides what's collected and who decides what's collected, and then how do you, like, is there a benchmark? Like we collect things that, you know, meet this, and this requirement.
So I'll add to that. I'm the only like museum professional on our team. So I'll add that we know that in order to be chartered by NYSED, you need to have a collections management policy. But what Ashley, I think, is trying to get at is like who makes the decision about that? Not like what, like, do you have a collections policy? What does it say? But like who are the people and how are they connected to those collections pieces, like that, those pieces of material culture and ephemera that you're collecting. So that's Aria put it in the museum professional language. And I just want to name that John and I think Scarlett put some, John and Scarlett put some really interesting resources in the chat for folks. Kayla says that she does, but she has a collections committee who helps choose. And it's all related, it's all town related. So Kayla must be from like a municipality. So yeah, I'm interested in that too. How do you make decisions about your collection? Who does that? Waterloo, yay.
I think for me as a person, when I was younger, I went to a couple museums, but I can honestly say the only museum I've ever been excited to go to is the Smithsonian Museum. And I know a lot of other Black and brown folks who also feel that same excitement. And it's because we can go there and see ourselves. So that's why I asked the question.
You're talking about the African American Museum of History and Culture, a Smithsonian? Yep. Yeah, it's amazing. I was muted and started talking. Or if you don't want to answer Ashley's prompt, just what else is on your mind around this? I mean, I had asked a bunch of questions earlier around kind of where are you with this work? So I'm thinking about things like, trying to find my notes. where do you see yourself on your journey? First of all, like, do you feel new in this journey? Do you feel like you're getting settled in the journey? Also, like, what about what policies do you have? Like, do they dismantle racism or are they upholding it? You know, we've got some stuff coming into the chat. Go ahead, Ashley.
I was gonna say, I felt tons of answers are coming into the chat. And I just want to, like, I don't want people just typing and then, like, I want to be able to read some of them. So if that's okay. It says our collection scope technically defines what we collect, but I, as an archivist curator, work with other collection committees to decide what gets accepted. We sometimes actively look for particular items, but generally speaking, it's dependent on what people are bringing to us to donate, which limits us in some ways, which leads to like another question. So like, one, I think the last time we did this, I learned that people can bring things to museums to have put on display or to donate. I didn't know that people could do that. So I'm thinking, if I don't know that you can do this, how many other brown and Black people don't know that you can do this? And then what is the breakdown of the people who do know and are bringing these things? Like, is it majority white people? Is it majority older people? Like, how do you get the information out that this is a thing that can happen so that more people do participate and that what you're getting is more diverse? Sorry.
Yeah, I think it just it's sort of that like difference between like passive collecting and active collecting. Like passive is sort of like waiting to see who brings you stuff, and then like the person who commented said like that's is kind of limiting, and like Ashley just brought up like that's who's bringing you stuff and what are they bringing you. And I know if people have heard me talk about this before, they know that I'm obsessed with the Brooklyn History Center's project that they do with Muslim folks in Brooklyn around keeping objects in situ and preserving the objects alongside the family that's using them, and collecting oral histories and object descriptions and things like that, that their collection isn't necessarily the material culture. It's for that specific project, it's the description of the object and how it gets used, and then oral histories around it, which I feel like also for me does some of that work of dismantling white supremacy of like, well, this is the best thing and we need to put it on display and it needs to never be touched again. Because when you're talking about communities that are grounded in relationship, they use their stuff. They don't, it doesn't go in a case and not get touched, it gets used. We have a lot more coming in. Scarlett says, where I volunteer, I don't know how to say this, right? Sorry, Center for Immigrant History and Culture. They are just forming this. The collection committee that was formed is split with those who want to focus building collections versus outreach. Mostly, I think the focus will be on building oral stories versus getting more stuff. This also brings up for me, whenever we talk about this, I think of my colleague, Erin Richardson, who talks a lot about, is the act of collecting a racist act? Because then you're filling up your shelves with specific stuff. And is it the stuff you should be collecting? Is it the stuff you should be saving? And she'll be able to talk more about that, hopefully at one of our dialogues. But I just think about like the actual act of collecting. How is that racist or anti-racist? Kayla, this chat's moving fast. Sorry. The donor will bring it into me and I will see if we have anything that is matching or similar. Yeah. Because you want to watch out for duplicates. And my colleague and I, with input from stakeholders and understanding community needs, make the decision, ideally guided by collection development policy that will incorporate these needs once it's revised. Awesome. This webinar is part of my journey on that. That's awesome, Sarah. As the archivist, our curator makes the decisions. We accept all city town related materials that we can take care of, Becky says. Joseph says, I work for a Catholic diocese and a large part of the decision is up to him. That's awesome, guided by collections policy. That's one of the things that increasingly disturbs me because I'm aware of my inherent bias. Ooh, love this. We are primarily an institutional archive, so we don't actively collect from the public. Interesting, Joseph.
I saw one from Kayla. It says, I just personally on an Indian exhibit. I didn't feel it depicted properly.
Yeah.
I'm bringing us up to date. First of all, that's amazing. I feel like that is a clear example of like interrupting racism and the space that you're in. But I have a question. So you said you took it down because you didn't feel like it was like a proper depiction. So who are you talking to inform what a proper depiction would look like? I'm gonna go back on mute.
Yeah, I don't know if Kayla wants to raise her hand and jump on sound. She could tell us more about that. That would be amazing, Kayla. I don't know. I think about this when I'm thinking about like we have a lot of in New York State. I feel like our museums, large and small, have a lot of like Native American like diorama exhibits. And the American Museum of Natural History, I don't know if there's anybody who's, you know, who's associated with them here today, but like a long time ago, decades ago, they started treating some of their dioramas like historical pieces that they could interpret. And so they started putting up, like they have the big gallery, you know, of like savanna animals. And that felt really important to me because it was like, how do we understand like the space and time that this diorama was created in, and how we're sharing that with our public. The RMSC, the Rochester Museum and Science Center, like, oof, Amanda, I don't even know if you were on the team then. When did Museum Association of New York have their conference in Rochester? Or like 2018 maybe?
Oh yeah, I think it was right before.
Right before you came on.
Right
okay,
me.
So the RMSC has this diorama of Rochester in like, I don't know, 1840 or something like that. But like almost all the people in the diorama were white. There were like 2 Black people or whatever in it. And so one of their projects was to use census records to identify what the like racial makeup of the community would have been. And then they essentially like fixed the diorama. They had to do a bunch of other like restoration work on it, and then they took that opportunity to also update it so it would be like factually accurate. So I love stuff like that. I think, did Kayla say she raised her hand? Yes, she did. Can we Leah, can you bring Kayla into the conversation so Kayla can talk a little bit about the exhibit she was sharing that she took down?
And then as Kayla is coming into the conversation, a question to just think about and ponder on is, what is the most difficult things that you guys are running into when trying to create equity in the organization that you work for? Like, and this is a like tell the truth question, because sometimes it's very difficult, but like we only get change when we tell the truth about what it is. So I'm interested to know what, I work for the ACLU and I run into difficulties. So, and we're a civil liberties organization. So I'm sure it's everywhere, but I'm interested to know that after Kayla talks.
So if I'm going to be completely honest, I haven't spoken to anyone else, but the longhouse that we had in the museum had been up for 30 years, if not a little bit longer. And people had just started putting things on it, and it was starting to fall down and decay. And there was nails in it, and they just, the way that they had built it was not the way that our Native Americans would have built their longhouses, not with nails per se. And that's just from looking at the artifacts that we do have in our collection. There's no nails. So I wanted to take it down and just bring light to the collection that I did have. so people could see it better. And we also had like a fireplace in it, and it was half built. And I just felt that it wasn't doing us any justice. And I had heard from the community when I was volunteering and when I had started that they just really didn't like the looks of it. And I had gotten approval from committee just to take it down.
Thanks for sharing that. So I know Chessie had lifted up a comment around some of the work they're doing with the Indigenous community local to her organization. Chessie, I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, because you put some pretty transformative stuff in the chat. Yeah, Chessie has her hand raised. Could we bring her in, Leah? Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. Welcome.
Awesome. Thanks. So I work for a historic Saranac Lake, which is up in the Adirondacks. And there was a sort of definitive history of the Adirondacks. I put that in quotes, but you can't see me. That was written, you know, in the 19-teens, I think, by a white man, of course, who, you know, started and perpetuated for a long time the myth that the Native Americans passed through, you know, it was a hunting ground and they came here seasonally and, you know, all sorts of things like that in order to sort of erase their use of the land and, you know, sort of, I think, minimize the, you know, settlement of the area. And so even us as an organization, I mean, I've been here for 7 years, and when I first started, that was still something that we repeated like in our tours, you know, and so in the last, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years, we've been working with the local, the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center, and the family that, the family that operates it, the Faddens, to, you know, update that myth for ourselves and make sure that we're telling the correct story to the public. And that includes interpretation in our new museum space as we expand the museum, you know, that acknowledges that that was a myth that was told for a long time, and that we were, you know, part of that. And also, you know, we're in the process of doing a grant-funded film that talks about the history of the Native cultures in the area for museum visitors, with paid help from the Faddens. So that's something that we thought was really, you know, important because, you know, it's easy to lean on other organizations, but, you know, we all should get paid for our expertise and, you know, really make them part of the interpretation for the area.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Ashley, do you have follow-up and questions?
I was gonna say, so to me, that is a good example of what reparations look like. After you've told an incorrect story for so long, I think sometimes people try to ask people to volunteer the racism away. And like, one, you need to pay people for their work and their services, but then also, like, it's just an amazing example of like what should be happening in museums across America. Like that very thing that she just described. So that's amazing. Shout out to you guys.
Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah, we have so many good things coming in right now. So I'm just going to name a couple comments that I saw. And if you want to join the conversation, raise your hand, and then Leah will pull you into the conversation. Okay. First of all, a couple really good questions about boards and governance and how who serves on our board influences the ability to be racist and anti-racist, or, you know, I don't want to say the ability to be racist, but when, you know, like if we choose racist policies, systems, and practices over anti-racist policy systems and practices. Somebody, I think Joseph, mentioned that the board is not reflective of the community that's developing because our communities are changing, like we talked about toward the beginning of our time together. Steve Main put a really interesting comment around scientific and technical organizations and how do you embrace the opportunities? Is he missing opportunities? Miguel put in a really interesting comment around donors. So if any of those folks wanted to jump in, that would be awesome. I would love to hear more about some of that. So I don't know if folks can, sometimes we can be in the chat, but we can't be in the
while folks are coming off mute, I feel like I talk so much, but I'm sorry, y'all. While folks are coming off mute, I think this question of boards is across organizations, right? Because it's a big issue in my organization. It was an issue in the last organization. And we, in the height of the BLM movement and work that was being done across the country, but specifically in New York, we had 2 older white men who had been sitting on our board for a very, very, very long time, fly into Rochester actually to basically say that, you know, the work that we were doing around Black Lives Matter was wrong and that I should be fired and blah, 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 blah. But for me, this is not anything new. This is what will continue to happen. And when I had the opportunity to speak to the board, and I was able to use Kodak as an example here of what will happen when you don't move along with the times. And we were able to use that as a conversation of like, when film was going digital, Kodak was like, nah, like we're not moving. And and now we see what happened in Rochester to one of the biggest organizations or biggest company that employed tons of people, thousands of people here. And boards are, listen, it flows from the top down. Whatever the biggest problem on the board, that's going to be the same problem that flows throughout the organization. Ultimately, all of the Black and brown people in our organization got together to say, these 2 people will get off the board or all of us will quit. And those 2 people were removed. That is very dramatic, but we were in a time that was very dramatic. So we had to do what was dramatic. But the board situation, I feel like it happens around in any organization. And it is such a poison to organizations because it can be the death of an organization. People just don't want to move with the times. And when you don't, if you're not progressing, you're dying. Like, people like to use the word stagnant, but if you're not moving forward, the organization, the work is dying. And I think as people who hold the work and hold the history, it's our responsibility to always make sure the work is moving forward. As an organizer, as someone who every day is writing policies and laws, I feel a weight to make sure that the work is always moving forward for the liberation of Black and brown folks. And if we're ever at a point, and a board will get you at a standstill point, and if you're at a standstill point too long, you are dying. And I think, like, when people hear it from that perspective, they understand what is at stake. Sorry, I'm going back on mute. I promise I'm not going to get off for a long time.
That's number one, not true. We all know that's not true. And we don't want that. So the other thing I just want to name, the other thing that Amanda, Ashley, and I try to do is when we're co-facilitating, we try to center Ashley's voice. She gets like self-conscious and says like, I'm going to stop talking. But one of the things that we intentionally do as a team when we're co-facilitating is try to lift Ashley's voice without her having to do the most work. And so that is like an active, intentional piece that we pull into our co-facilitations to help sort of illustrate that this work doesn't only fall on Ashley's shoulders. This work is spread between the 3 of us, and that's an actively anti-racist choice between the 3 of us. However, Ashley is the person with lived experience on our team about what it's like to be a Black woman. And so when we're talking about that, we center her voice. And so I just want to name that because we decided when we were embarking on this work with DHPSNY and the New York State Archive and Library that we would name some of our co-facilitation techniques so that we would be able to model them a little more transparently. I have stuff to say about boards because, you know, that's like a huge area of practice for us is boards and governance. And Amanda and I got to work on this amazing project in 2020, which yes, was a little delayed by the pandemic, but ended up being awesome. We wrote a board recruitment strategy with the Rockwell Museum in Corning. So shout out to them. We love Brian and his whole team, and their board is just amazing. And you know, it's Corning, so they get tons of support from Corning Inc. And Corning Inc. is really there in the forefront around understanding how all of this influences the work they do and how they show up. So I would just say that when we started that board recruitment strategy, we had not been really talking about the Indigenous communities around Corning. But for those of you who don't know, the Rockwell collects Indigenous art. That's like that's like their thing. Like the Rockwells, who founded the museum, had this huge collection of Western Native art and also art created by white artists depicting the American West and the Native Americans who lived in the American West. And so as we got more into it, we got into this conversation around who's not here that should be here. And this kept coming up, like the Native community should be here. And they have like a robust Native community like infrastructure. So there's this whole resource that they could be tapping into. And that was really exciting because the board identified that as like an important piece of their board recruitment strategy to help better reflect doing the mission of the organization and also reflect the community around the organization. And so it was a really, that felt like a really big deal to me. And I was really excited when that happened. So shout out to them, and what a pleasure it was to have that epiphany alongside them. I think we've got a few more minutes. So stuff is coming into the chat. Yeah. Joseph says that's a tricky balance to achieve. It sure is. Steve says boards forget that when organizations stop growing, they immediately start losing relevance, which impacts their legitimacy and funding. And this is like, okay, Steve, thank you for saying that. And I want to pull it to like Miguel's comment around donors, that how do we balance like this need for funding and the just all the stuff related to that, like the spoken and unspoken pieces. And I feel like Ashley said this at the very beginning, like we don't have all the answers. And this is something that I grapple with all the time. And we also do a lot of work with philanthropy, like with foundations and philanthropic organizations at Aria Strategies. And this is a huge conversation, this trust-based philanthropy, getting money into the hands of the people who know the thing. Ashley always says the people closest to the thing know the most about the thing. And so how do you transfer resources into their hands to get the work done? And I like to remind people that non-white people have been excluded for so long from white dominant systems that they already have parallel high functioning systems in place. They don't need our white systems, they already have their own. And they're closest to the thing and they've pretty much figured out the thing. And so how do we transfer our resources? How do we do this in an anti-racist way? I get all excited about that stuff. And I did want to touch base on Steve's comment about the scientific and technical organizations. I'm never going to be able to dig back through the chat. So Steve, I apologize. I'm going to try to paraphrase. Steve can't come off mute for this webinar, but essentially for the folks who work in primarily scientific and technical organizations where most of your collections focus around like whatever like the scientific or technical thing is, but you might have like the name of the scientist or something, like where, like, are you missing opportunities? Where are the opportunities to infuse anti-racist systems, policies, and practices? And I wanted to open that up to Amanda and Ashley, that when say you're not collecting, when you're not collecting art, say, or stuff people use in their homes, when you're interpreting history of science stuff and science stuff, how do you infuse anti-racism into that? I wonder if you two have thoughts on that.
So can you give me an example of like, so can you give me an example of like collecting like science and like, what are you talking about? Because like, I'm thinking like planetariums, but I don't know, what are you talking about?
Yeah, no, think about the RMSC, right? Have you been to the planetarium at the RMSC, maybe with Ashley? And they have those exhibits of like planets, and they might have on the label like this scientist first saw this planet on this date or something like that. So like the RMSC that's like essentially like in Rochester, our like natural history museum and like science museum and stuff like that. But they have this amazing planetarium. Steve just put in collecting physics experiments history of an organization. So really interesting. I think of Corning, like Corning Inc., like the history of like Pyrex dishes. And I can tell you how Corning has done this in their exhibits, but I want to hear from Ashley and Amanda first. So Ashley, when we're talking about stuff that doesn't seem to have anything to do with race, how do we build in anti-racism?
So I think the most powerful thing that a person can say is like, I don't know. So I don't want to speak without knowing what I'm talking about. So give me a minute to think about this. Think about it a little bit and that's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think,
go ahead.
I think the number one thing I would say is how we tell the stories. But again, give me a second to think about this. It's a really good question and I don't have the answer right off the top of my head. But I'm willing to look for the answer and get back to you guys. But that's a good question.
Yeah.
Because like race when you're talking about the stars.
Yeah. Amanda, what about you? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I also would want to think about it a little bit deeper and a little bit longer. But something that comes immediately to mind is, I think a lot of times, well, I don't think, I know, I know that a lot of times you have Black and brown folks who have done incredible work in a variety of fields, and they're very rarely recognized, or it's kind of told a different way of like a different white man who was actually like the story gets told about somebody who didn't maybe do most of the legwork. And I can't think of like specific names or examples, but I know that especially all during Black History Month, like my Facebook feed was full of stories of, Black women scientists who did incredible work, and we've never heard their names. And so I think that, intentionally looking for those stories and lifting up those stories and making sure that they're being told and that the credit is really going to, who did that work, or at least did a lot of that work. I know that so often the thoughts and the labor of Black and brown folks is taken for granted and taken advantage of. So I think any opportunity that you can intentionally look for those stories and lift them up and give those folks credit is a really good place to start. But I want to think about this more too, because it's a really good question.
Yeah, I would agree. And thinking about it more, but the first thing that comes to mind is like the story of Henrietta Lacks, the story of Mary Jackson, and like the roles that they played in history that we're just hearing about today. It would be dope to go into a museum and see an exhibit of that. But just making sure the stories that we are telling are diverse and that we are actually doing the work to look for the stories. Yeah, but that's all that's a really good question. I'm going to think on it more, but that's all I have right now.
Yeah, I think so. +1 on Amanda and Ashley, +1 on the people in the chat who are offering up suggestions. And I would say your policy systems and practices can always use an anti-racist makeover 100% of the time. So even before you get to who should we talk about and how should we talk about them and where's the stuff that helps us tell the story, even before you get there, you need to think about who decides what you're talking about. How are you deciding? Do you have an anti-racist lens on your collections management policy? Do you have an anti-racist lens on your hiring and employee stewardship? Do you have an anti-racist lens on your volunteer stewardship and your donor stewardship? How are you doing the business of your organization. I'm going to let Ashley have the last word on this, and then she's going to take us into next steps in our invitation to continued learning. So Ashley, I'm going to go to you for our last word on this conversation.
So I was going to say, I think this is a principle that goes across organizations. Like, I'm screaming this to my church right now. I go to a very, I'm probably one of the youngest people at my church. That's ridiculous, but I am. I go to a very old church, and I mean old in years and like older and wiser in people. But one thing that is a principle for me is if we're not growing, we're dying. And in thinking about this, I think another question that's coming to mind is like, how are we engaging young people? How are we engaging them in like these conversations of what we're collecting? I'm learning so much just from these comments. I can't imagine how, many other young people would be interested in this. So like, are there internships? Are there like active outreach to community members and Black and Brown folks across the diaspora to get them involved? I'm screaming this to my church every day. Like, what is the plan? I tell my pastor, you put blood, sweat, and tears into this church for 20 years. And when you die, the church is going to die if there's not a plan. So like, what is the plan to get young people? And I think that principle goes across organizations. So that's the last thing I'm going to say. I mean, probably not the last thing, but that's my last comment for this. How are we engaging young people to carry on the work? Yeah, that's it.
And now you get to tell us about next steps.
Oh, I was like, wait, is it still on me? Okay. Sorry. So next step. So there's gonna be a post-survey session. That might be through a link in the chat, or you guys will get it in the packet that we're gonna send out after this conversation. Please feel free to fill out the survey. Like, not feel free to, please fill out the survey. It helps us so that we do these things better. And then it helps us measure if this is actually helping people. We want to invite folks to continue learning. So there is a YouTube video. It's called Finding the Courage to Interrupt Bias. That's also going to be, I think, either put in the chat or given to you guys in the package at the end of this. It's about 20 minutes long, right? And it's a really good YouTube clip about what you can do in the space that you're in to interrupt bias. And then, if you want to be like extra super, once you click on that video on the side, you guys know YouTube, there will be tons of more videos that you can dig into. And then there's going to be another dialogue on May 12th at noon. I don't know if I'm going to be there, but I'm going to try to convince Aria to let me be there. So I will see you guys then. And yeah, just thank you guys for listening to us. I know when me, Aria, and Amanda get together, it could be a lot of like, we forget that we have an audience and we just go on like it's the three of us. So just thank you guys so much for your time today. I hope that it was important, helpful, and I hope we didn't do a lot of just talking at you guys. My favorite part is the participatory part. So I'm excited to see where we build from here, and I'm gonna be quiet and give it back to you.
You can give it back to me.
Aria. Okay.
Awesome. So yeah, so Ashley was talking about, we're going to send you stuff afterwards. So the good folks at DHPSNY are really good at this. I send Leah and Marissa a bunch of information and they make sure it gets to you. So you'll get this continued learning activity. You'll get the post-session survey, which we hope that you'll complete so that we can improve our process and our content for next time. And you'll also get those working definitions. You'll get a bunch of resources. I know somebody had popped in the chat, what about, research around the business case piece? And we have a bunch of research to share with you there. Some peer reviewed, some not. If you need anything or you have questions, always reach out. We're super duper available to you to continue this conversation. And I do hope that you'll join us in May for our next dialogue. And if Ashley wants to help moderate that with me and Amanda, I will happily have her there. Our checkout for today is how will you use principles of anti-racism in your organizations or your own practice? And so I'd invite you to share that in the chat so your colleagues can see and affirm your commitments and also hold you accountable to your commitments. So I'd like everybody to pop in the chat. How will you use your principles of anti-racism in your organizations or your own practice give us one or two examples of how you're going to do that. And as you do that, I am going to toss it over to Leah for any last minute housekeeping stuff. And my last word on this is thanks so much for being with us. Thanks to Ashley and Amanda for co-facilitating. Thanks to DHPSNY for hosting us. And thanks to the New York State Archive and Library for funding such important work. Leah, over to you.
Just really quickly want to thank everyone again for joining us. And please keep an eye out at dhpsny.org/education for all of our future programming. And as Aria mentioned, we are going to be sending out an email within the next week or so with all of those resources, as well as the recording to this webinar and a PDF version of the slideshow. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.